Hello, this is Brooklands Members TV. My name's Gareth Tarr, and we're here today to interview Richard Jenkins about his book, Tyrrell, the story of the Tyrrell Racing Team. Many of you may have been here when he did the talk earlier this year, and we had the launch here of the book. So welcome, Richard, again to Brooklands.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us. So maybe, Richard, I could start by asking you what motivated you to write the book. Why did that come about? Or, what connections do you have maybe to the Tyrrell family?
Well, the genesis of it was, to go right back to the start, and again, I don't know if you're aware, and the members be aware, 3 years ago I won the RAC Book of the Year for Richard Gimfer, a book about Richard Gimfer,
right.
The former Ferrari and Honda driver.
Right.
Through that, Mark Hughes, who's the editor at Evro, we talked about a few things, and we were going through a few ideas, and Mark said, well, what about Tyrrell? They've never had a book about the whole history. It's mainly been either focused on Ken, quite naturally, or it's been focused on the Jackie Stewart era, again naturally. But we've had nothing about Alesi or Brundle or all the many drivers that they've had. So we went back and thought, yes, I like the sound of that. They were always a team that I always had a soft spot for. I started following racing probably about 86, 85, 86.
Okay.
And they weren't the top team, but they were a team that you very swiftly gained a lot of fondness for. First thing I did was track down Bob Tyrrell, because they still run the Tyrrell promotions, which you may be aware of.
Yes, because he was here at the talk and told us about that.
Yeah, and what I didn't want to do was spend...
And Bob Tyrrell is Ken Tyrrell's son,
yes. Ken's got
and
two
he worked
sons
part
still
of the team during the time,
And Bob was very much involved with the team, and for a while was effectively the de facto team owner when Ken stepped back a little bit. But got in touch with Bob and I said, look, there's two questions I've got for you before I start. Number one, I want to make sure that no one else is writing a book about Tyrrell.
Of course, you don't want to waste your time.
Because this has recently happened with Shadow. Somebody spent about 5 years interviewing everybody at Shadow, and then another book came out about the team, and
killed that.
That was unfortunately a waste of time for him. The other thing I said is, look, I know you don't necessarily want to authorise it. I'm not asking you to authorise it, but is it okay if I write it? And he said, well, I've got no problem you writing about the team because it would only work in favour of his promotions after all.
Sure.
So he gave me the green light, and what I decided to do initially was contact the mechanics, because bear in mind this was still in between lockdowns with COVID.
Right, okay.
When I started. So I got in touch with the Grand Prix Trust and said, this is what I like to do. Can you tell me about all your Tyrrell mechanics? But this is what I'm aiming to do, and I want to hear from them.
Yeah.
I will, obviously, as we'll talk later, get in touch with Jackie Stewart and Martin Brundle and all that sort of thing. But I would like to talk to the mechanics because they've never had their say. And the response, whether it was COVID, whether it was the fact that people hadn't had their say, they got in touch in their multitudes. So.
Well, I think as well, one thing that comes across in the book and came across in the interviews you did here when we had the book launch was very much it was a family team, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But it sort of feels that Tyrrell was it was a different team. I mean, I'm sure every team thinks it's unique, but there was something very unique. That's probably a bad expression, but it was it was special to work for Tyrrell, and it wasn't like anywhere else.
There were certain characters within the team, and quite a few of them are featured in here. One of the highlights of the book has definitely been Keith Bosher, and his photo archive.
Right.
And Keith was very much I'm trying to be polite, but he was quite a solitary figure, but he had a great passion for Tyrrell, and obviously that shows through the photos. But he would not have fitted in anywhere else.
No, I thought, there were an awful lot of them would never have walked up the road to McLaren. They would never have been shown the door.
A lot, and what came back about the people that worked there is some of them obviously had very long careers elsewhere in Formula One, but what they learned at Tyrrell, because they had much more responsibility. And I'm just going to use one chap that was here at the launch, a chap called Graham Hurd, who joined the team solely to work on the gearbox. That was his role.
Yeah.
And then he morphed into gearbox design. Then he morphed into chassis design. And he had much more of a wider set of tools, as it were. And then he went on to work for Benetton and Renault and stuff like that. But because of the opportunities given to him, and he not only learnt and took all that to Benetton, but if the finance at Tyrrell was not there, the ideas weren't just thrown away. And in the end, his gearbox was the all-successful gearbox when McLaren dominated in 87, 88.
Wasn't
it was actually Graham's design for that gearbox that was developed by obviously a team at McLaren.
Right.
So that just shows, but it wasn't just unique; it was somewhere.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it was always a small team. Even we know that the Formula One teams grew and grew and grew, and now they're hundreds of people. Yes. I went to a talk 3 or 4 years ago now, possibly pre-pandemic, given by a guy who was an aerodynamicist at Renault, and he was only responsible for the front end of the car, and the car was divided into, I don't know whether theirs was 2 or 3, but he said that's the standard in all the teams. The aerodynamics, you just don't do the whole car. Somebody does the front, somebody does the back, somebody might even do the middle, and whereas Tyrrell would be a small team, and everybody got responsibility for things because somebody had to do it, and you seem to be okay, you do that, I guess that was the sort of attitude.
The old story is, but in 1971, when they won all before them, 13 members, and that includes the drivers, Ken and Nora. You've got more than that, I think, doing a pit stop in Brazil, for one
they probably have more in the motorhome doing the catering.
But yes, it was always a small team, and even in 1998, their last year, 97-98, there was still only about 150. Which sounds a lot, obviously, from 13. But I think McLaren and Williams at that time had 450, 500, and obviously they were growing. As things became more technical. So it was always a small outfit.
One thing that came across when I read the book, and I think we've already alluded to it a bit, and it's a word I used. My review of your book is in the latest bulletin, the Brooklands Bulletin. The one word that struck me was thorough.
Yes.
And I think we've touched on that. You seem to leave no stone unturned. Anybody you could get hold of, you talked to. Was there anybody you would have liked to have talked to who you didn't get hold of?
There is.
Or can you not say that?
No, I can say it. The reason I'm smiling is there's a Jenkins blacklist.
Right.
Which is, there were only 8 people, 8 drivers, I should say, that I couldn't get hold of.
Right.
And I'll mention a couple of them. I'm not going to go through all that.
Yeah, that's fine.
But all the family helped. 32 of the 40 drivers helped. which is
I think it's pretty good.
And
pretty good hit rate,
including
really.
people like Mike Fackwell, who has been extremely reclusive.
It's a strange story, his. Maybe we'll talk about that later.
So he helped Alessandro Vicente Rossi, who's never done this kind of thing before in Italy. John Rhodes, who's nearly 97, I think.
Right.
So it was because I went to the mechanics. It was a kind of a butterfly domino effect, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But the mechanics speak to each other. Yeah, this guy's all right.
Yeah,
and then they speak to the family. Yeah, this guy's all right. And then the drivers start speaking to themselves. Of the 8, the one that was the only one that I think could have helped enhance the book was, and he's not remembered very much now, but Olivier Grouillard, who raced in 1992.
Yeah.
And the only reason for that is because unfortunately Andrea de Cesaris is obviously no longer with us.
Right.
So there was no voice from the 92 season.
Right.
But we kind of got around it because the 92 season was not a
very special.
No, a special one either way. But it would just be nice to have his
Sure.
But we kind of talked about it afterwards, me and the editor, and we said, why would Grouillard get involved? Because it was not a good year. English is not his first language.
And presumably he didn't have a good season.
Unless he wanted to set the record straight specifically, I wasn't expecting him to. There's a slight. It would have been nice to have had Jos Verstappen's thing. He was very, despite what people seem to say or think about Jos Verstappen.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I would say about him, he was extremely polite.
Right.
When I approached him,
mm-hmm.
and he said, "Look, I'm really, really sorry. I don't get involved with books because obviously there's a lot of people trying to cash in on match as well.
Sure.
I don't get involved, but I wish you all the best." And then he was the same with the launch here.
Yeah.
He said, "Look, for understandable reasons, I don't really want to come, but again, thank you very much."
Invite,
so he was okay, but the 2 that are on my blacklist are Jonathan Palmer and Johnny Herbert.
Really?
Mainly because they didn't get back in touch.
Right.
And I don't mind people saying no.
No.
They've all got their own reasons.
Absolutely.
And some people that said no later said yes. But Palmer kept fudging the reasons as to why he didn't want to get involved. We've worked around that, and I researched the problem with Palmer not getting involved because he was there 3 years.
Yeah.
There were quite a few intricate things I would have liked to pull out. He said initially, I've said everything I need to say, but you haven't heard what I want to ask you.
Yeah.
But he has done quite a few interviews at the time, he's done quite a few interviews later, so we get around that, and I think if you read it, you don't notice, but Palmer, it's not obvious, but Palmer hasn't helped. Herbert was the same, surprisingly again, considering he's cheeky chappy.
He seems a very sort of engaging sort of guy.
At the very least, I'd like to tell my friend. It didn't matter too much because he was only there for 2 races and he didn't qualify for 1. Mm-hmm. So again, in his stellar career, Tyrrell is... Perhaps
Tyrrell is something he'd rather not talk about.
There is that possibility, but again, it would have just been polite for him to say no. But as I say, there are reasons. When you consider the other 32.
Well, I think that's quite a good hit rate, really. I can't imagine that most people get that percentage.
Well, people said, I think it was just over 80%, and people said you'll never get 80. Never get 80. You might get 40, you might get 60.
And it's a shame, Palmer, because apart from the fact, as you say, he was there 3 years. I mean, he did win that Jim Clark Trophy, which was, for people watching who don't know, in the mid-80s when turbos came in and dominated, there were still some teams running Cosworth. In fact, I think at one stage, wasn't the rules they had to be all turboed, and then they switched back and said you could have normal aspirated, or did the normal aspirated always stay? I can't remember.
Tyrrell had to switch everybody had to switch from 84
about 84,
onwards.
85, yeah.
Yeah.
But then they brought back the not normally aspirated.
Yeah.
I think because the new rules were coming for 89, was it, or 90?
Beginning of 89.
And I think they were 3.5
yeah.
litres then, weren't
Yes.
they? But for those who don't remember or know that period, the FIA ran a sort of subcategory, so it was almost two classes. So there was the turbo cars, but they recognised that some of the small teams could get by running a Cosworth or whatever else they could get their hands on. And they actually ran a championship for it, which we call the Jim Clark Trophy.
Yes, and the Colin Chapman Trophy. As well.
One was for the driver, one was for the car.
Yeah.
And Tyrrell won both, I think.
Yes.
Jonathan Palmer won the driver's one, which I presume was the Jim Clark one, was
yes.
it? That's right. So it was a shame that you couldn't get him for that, because that would have been interesting to hear his take on the fact that he was a sort of world champion, but never, he was a Formula One world champion.
But
in a way.
I was lucky, very lucky in the end, because I interviewed Philippe Streff,
right,
who sadly died just before Christmas.
Yes, and it was one of the things in the book. Actually, there's quite a few people who died just before you finished the book, I think.
I've been lucky.
Yeah.
I've been lucky. There were only two drivers. Jean-Pierre Jabouille was already too ill, unfortunately. Right. So again, I've been extremely lucky with the age and the health and the memories of people. But Streff filled out a lot of I think the reason we didn't miss Palmer too much is because, obviously, from a British media point of view, Palmer has always been that one to go to.
Of course.
Not many people have gone to Streff. And he covered quite a few things, but I probably wouldn't have got from Palmer even if I'd spoken to him.
Yeah.
So that was quite nice. The only other chap that died afterwards was Slim Borgard.
Right.
And again, that was quite a shocking decline, because I spoke to him July 2022. I don't know if anybody remembers Slim, but he was a very eluberant character.
I don't remember him as a character. I do remember him being in Formula One. Yeah.
And he was, he wanted to tell me stories about ATS as well, because ATS.
I was going to say I was associated with ATS.
And then a unique
they were a bit on board, weren't they?
But he said, "Oh, I must tell you about ATS," and I said, "Look, Slim, I've got enough here for Tyrrell. Unfortunately, I can't take orders for ATS yet, but we'll get together." But very shortly after that, he was diagnosed with very aggressive form of dementia,
right,
and died of complications of it only like 6 months later. I wouldn't have envisaged that, but I've been extremely lucky, really. But going back, we cover some of the Formula Junior days and Formula 3 days. And obviously we've got Sir Jackie in his 80s, we've got Warwick Bank in his 80s, Peter Proctor, John Rhodes.
By definition, it's 20 odd years since the team was in existence. Yes. So, anybody who was with the team and was even 50 years old is now in 70s. Most of them are probably pensioners that were with Tyrrell.
Yeah. So we were quite lucky, but there were key people still around, and in good memory as well, to fill in the gaps. And again, I say in the introduction, if I wanted to, and I chose to, I could have written a book solely on what's out there already.
Sure.
But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to add something different.
And my next sort of question was going to be, one of the things that struck me when I read the book was how even it was. As you say, lots of people write books about teams or cars or whatever and concentrate on the golden years. But this is so even. You put as much effort to the early years as you do the glory years, as you do the declining years and the sale years. It's almost as if And I don't want to put people off who might read the book. It's not as if it's, this year we did this, this and this. This year they did this and this, and here's the list of results. It's not like that at all.
No.
It does flow very nicely. But what I'm trying to say is it's a very even emphasis. So you've never sort of bigged up the big years more than the little years, if one can say that. And I thought that was one of the things I thought was very impressive about the book. And I think you've written a book that will be the Tyrrell book.
It seems,
not the Ken Tyrrell book. Obviously, there's been biographies of Ken Tyrrell, but the team definitive history. Yeah. And funny enough, I recently reviewed as well. There's one come out this year called Super Bears, which is about the Hesketh team, and that's very similar. Same size, same price, same. Very much, you'd have thought they actually came from the same publishers, but actually two different publishers. Funny enough, but again. I thought that again covered very evenly the story, written in a very different style, but very good book as well. And I thought, you deserve a lot of praise for keeping a very balanced level on, the chapters and how you. I presume that was. I think you've already touched on it. That was obviously a very conscious decision.
Well, thank you first of all for what you said. I found Tyrrell fascinating because. The more you looked into it, you've got the ups and downs all the way through. Literally, almost all the way through. And you haven't got... a few people have said, well, what would you write about next, or who would you write about next? And those that haven't had their story, like maybe Ensign or Arrows or people like that, there's not quite that scope, as it were. So you've got... For me, it was fascinating because you've got huge. I mean, people probably because of passage of time, people forget how successful Tyrrell were in a lower formula, junior formula, because they dominated Formula Junior, and they had,
And what you brought out was very much how professional they were, and I don't know. I mean, obviously that was Ken's personality, and I guess one of the things that possibly comes across there is Ken was a businessman in the first place. Had a timber merchant, so he was a businessman, and I think he probably in the lower formula he could do that objective businessman's assessment rather than the enthusiast who can't wait to get his spanner in his hand and work on the car. Ken knew how to run an organisation, and that probably was what made him stand out in Formula 3 or whatever grades he was at. So I can see that. But yes, to go back to the question, really, you obviously kept you kept the balance all the way through. That must have been quite difficult in the sense that the early years, the people who could have told you the stories perhaps weren't around as much as they were in the later years.
No. I mean, the biggest challenge was actually to cover what I call the golden years, 68 to 73, because they are the ones that are most written about. They are the ones, but if you've got fans of Tyrrell, the majority of the Tyrrell fan base is the Jackie Stewart. They started supporting Tyrrell during the Jackie Stewart. Well, not just Jackie, but he's obviously so synonymous with Tyrrell, as it's obvious. I wanted to do justice to that without reinventing the wheel and without going over all of it, because we've got it. If you want those golden years written in full detail, you can still find it. Doug Nye's Grand Prix Tyrrells, which covers up to beginning of 74. No, that's the thing. There hasn't been anything since 74. But I know there was actually more pressure for that bit because I need to do justice. I have got the people, obviously Sir Jackie's still around, and a lot of his mechanics, Joe Ramirez is still around from those days, and so on. But it was crucial not to the easy thing to do, I mean, this is 480 pages. The easy thing to do would be to devote 300 pages to the golden years and 180 pages to everything else. And I didn't want to do that, but I didn't want to feel that I was not concentrating on the thing. In the end, it takes up a quarter of the book, which I think is
right.
chronologically, I think is about right.
Yeah, I as I say, I thought it was a very balanced.
And what I also didn't want to do too much, though again you have to focus on it. The P34 is if there are two reasons, but the layman motorsport fan knows Tyrrell, P34 and Jackie Stewart.
Sure.
It has to be explored fully because it's such a unique car. But again, I didn't want there's so much. I mean, after the P34 goes in '77, you've got 21 years there, and you've got a number of different drivers who ended up becoming very famous. You've got unique things, innovative things. Times where they suddenly, all out of a sudden, Alesi qualifies second, finishes second at Phoenix in 1990. Stefano Modena could have won at Monaco in 91. Ukiyo Katayama, who was considered just a pay driver, suddenly turns into like a main challenger to Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill in 1994. Right. And it was all that kind of ups and downs, and even their last wins in 82 and 83 with Michele Alboreto, they were on the brink financially, they were going nowhere, and then all of a sudden Alboreto comes along, again we forget, employed as a pay driver only. Yeah, really his money kept Tyrrell alive.
I was looking at the talk you had here earlier this morning, and I think he brought money with him, didn't he?
And if he hadn't done so, then maybe this book wouldn't have been written, because it would have been the end in about 82, 83, and probably been covered in a different way. But that's what I mean. There were so many ups and downs. I mean, even 84, there was the ultimate up with Stefan Beloff coming along, and then the ultimate down with the being thrown out of the championship. So it actually became quite easy in some ways to balance it, because you had the counterbalance of good and bad years, and it maintained my interest. And when you write books, you don't have to be passionate about it. You can be a professional, of course, but if you're enjoying the subject, it shows. And I think this is.
I'd done a bit of writing, as I say, for the magazine, and I remember one of the former editors saying to me, when you've got something you're passionate about, it shows straight through, you know. And I think, just picking up on what we've been talking about, obviously, I'm a bit older than you, and I suppose I started following Formula One in 76, of course, when James Hunt won, and I was in my mid-teens, so he was an attractive character for a young man in his mid-teens, and I became more aware of it, and I particularly remember following Andretti in 77. So I sort of missed the Tyrrell good years, but they were still one of the top teams. Yes. After that, and if you sort of follow the history of Formula One, those were still years when you could buy a Cosworth, you could buy a Hewling gearbox, chat to Goodyear and get some tyres. You've got a racing car, and there's plenty of people who can machine a chassis for you. And Tyrrell was much that kind of operation, as were the others. Come the 80s, dear old Bernie Eccleston, but he professionalised Formula One at that time, very much so, and I saw that happening a lot. The money he brought into Formula One through TV deals, and he really professionalised the sport. And I think Tyrrell didn't. They sort of transitioned from being, in that period, from being one of the top teams, perhaps just after their glory years, but could still punch, quite well. But once that sort of came in, they moved, if you like, down the grid. They were one of the smaller teams, struggling on a budget, always, never quite there. Do you feel at any point, and I mean, it could have been even after that, was there a point, or even more than one point, where they could have actually switched back, where they could have had a major sponsor, or really when, as I say, when the turbos came in, you really needed a manufacturer behind you? Do you think Ken Tyrrell, I get the sense in the book Ken Tyrrell, through his personality, didn't want to give up all that control, and do you think there was possibly a point at which, a turning point, which, or the sliding doors point, they could have gone that way, they could have gone that way, they went that way? If they'd have gone that way, who knows what would have happened?
There's two significant sliding doors moments, both of which are in there, obviously. The first is back in late 1975. Renault invited Ken over to Paris and said, we want to build an engine. Do we build an engine? I can't remember exactly. I think it was a V12 engine.
Right.
So a standard V12 engine.
So a 3 litre.
Yeah. Do we build this, or do we build? Because they wanted his advice. Because obviously, you've got to remember Renault Elf, extremely.
Yeah, and obviously Elf was his major sponsor. There we are, right on the front page.
For years, and obviously the Matra link. So Ken, despite almost hating France, was so linked to France,
French organisation,
French drivers, etc. But they invited him and said, we can do a V12 or we can try a turbo engine. And Ken, ironically, said, well, if you do the V12 engine, fine, but it won't always be as good as the Ferrari V12 engine or whatever. It would just be another engine.
Because they'd been out the game for a long time. Yeah.
Why don't you try the turbo? Because it's something different, and it may not work, but at least you tried. And what people might not remember, I mean, it's just on this photo here. I don't know if I can. It's not very clear because it's a small photo, but we've got the Elf transporter. Mm-hmm. And this is 76, Sweden 76. Right. This is taken by the truckie, but drove that Terry Coleman. There's a yellow stripe on the transporter, and there's a yellow stripe on the P34 in 76. Yeah. And what was supposed to happen was that Renault would go, oh, lovely, thank you, Mr. Tyrrell. Here's your turbo engine for 76. And Ken went, no. I don't want a turbo engine, because he was not convinced at all that it would work. He said no. It'll be. He could give the advice, but he didn't want to follow up. And for those that don't remember, Renault went alone with the Tyrrell, with the turbo engine.
Yeah, Ken raced at 77. Silverstone was it? I think the first time.
Yeah, and it broke down. It broke down all the time.
Yeah,
and Ken went, I told you, a load of rubbish. And obviously, for those, but again, I can't remember, 79, Dijon. Yeah. Everybody remembers Villeneuve and Arnoux. Yeah. But in front of them was Jabouille.
And just toured through to victory,
And, he took it from there. And he obviously took another win, I think, 1980, off the top of my head. And from there on, the turbos were there. And yes, they were unreliable. Yes, they cost a lot, neither of which Ken enjoyed. Yeah. I think the other thing is obviously Ken had his contact. He was a very loyal. Not only was he loyal, but people were loyal to him, which shows. But he said, well, why do I want to upset Ford? Why would I move away from Ford? We were like that. And obviously different engine suppliers get different fuel, different tyres, potentially, other commercial demands. But had he stuck with it, then instead of being behind everybody with the turbos, he would have been at the front.
Yeah, and possibly as well, he would have brought the expertise to the Renault setup that they took years to correct. It took them 2 or 3 years to become a front team.
It could have been quicker. And I do think that they could have reasonably dominated late 70s. They nearly won.
Renault nearly won the championship, and I think it was 1983. And yes, it was, because Piquet won with a late burst. I think BMW came up with an upgraded engine, and the Brabham flew. And I always remember I was on holiday in France about a couple of months before the end of the season. I think there were 4 races to go. Alain Prost and the Renault were leading, and I remember seeing the billboards round France, and it had a picture of Alain Prost in the car, and it said une entreprise derrière son champion, which was a bit sort of and what happened next was not a very clever comment. They weren't so derrière their champion when as I say, Piquet had a late burst, won the championship, and Renault fired Prost, which sort of tells you something about Renault, and that wasn't really the thing to do. I think Prost was a little bit undiplomatic, so we say. Had that been Tyrrell, there might have been that slight difference. Yes. And I always remember as well, talking about that year, a journalist called Peter Windsor, who is a very respected journalist, I think he's still around, who used to write for Autocar. And I remember reading something he wrote of a review of the season, and he said the difference is that if Nelson Piquet, who's driving for Brabham, if he's got a problem, he goes and sees Bernie Ecclestone, who's the team owner, of course. Yeah. He said he might not get the answer he wants, but he'll get an answer. If Alain Prost has got a problem, he goes to Renault management, who then go report to a committee that might meet once a month. And I guess that might have made the difference from Renault's point of view. So it's we can all sit here and speculate, obviously, but it's an interesting thought. And as you say, maybe that would have made Tyrrell differently. I get the sense from reading the book. Ken was obviously very strong personality, very clear on what he wanted to do, and perhaps it was Ken. There was something about doing that was beyond. He didn't want to give up that control. He wanted to be.
I think it was more. I think with that one, the second sliding doors moment very much about control.
Yeah, we'll come on to
in a second. But I think with Renault, he looked at it as a businessman, like you said before. This is going to cost me more money.
Right.
I've got this kind of arrangement with Ford. Why should I potentially cost myself more money? I think he approached it in that particular way, and I think when it started clearly being more successful, I think that was just Ken being Ken and being a bit stubborn and a bit.
And he probably wouldn't see. You're talking about 74, 75. Yeah. The whole business everyone was run at a certain level. 10 years on, the money was much, much bigger. Yes. I remember, again, in the early 80s and over the winter period, and I remember saying to my dad, I said, Formula One's negotiated a big TV deal. There's an awful lot of money. They've moved up a step next, and I guess to be fair to Ken, he wouldn't see that coming.
No, not everybody did.
It was very much that business as usual.
Bernie obviously had that foresight and continued to have that foresight. The other one I would say is 1990, because what happened, I can't remember the exact genesis of it again, right off the top of my head, but in short, Ron Dennis, obviously because of the locality of Tyrrell and McLaren, Ron Dennis was involved and was kind of, I wouldn't say sniffing around, because the Tyrrell family were very much involved in this decision, but Tyrrell were having problems with sponsors continually, and the problem, but a nice problem that McLaren had is, but all these sponsors, you always want to be in a winning team. but they had more sponsors than they knew what to deal with. And basically Ken and Ron, who have always had a very close, maybe it's the wrong word, because both men are very unique in their approach, very different in their approach, but they always had a good respect for each other. And obviously we perhaps forget, but not only did Ken start as a driver, but Ron started as a mechanic for Cooper, and they had that kind of Cooper link as well.
Yeah.
Not at the same time, but they knew people who knew people. So Ron had a quick word with Ken and said, look, I've got these sponsors. I can't find them any space in the car. What do you say, but we help you out with sponsorship? And we'll get our marketing guy to work closely with you. So what they did, and this changed Tyrrell for the better. Some people won't admit it, but it did change Tyrrell for the better. So in 1990, they joined up. Joanne Villa-de-Prat became later team manager at Benetton.
Yeah.
He joined as team manager. He was at Ferrari. Initially, they made him chief mechanic, replacing Roger Hill, who'd been there since year dot. But then he kind of morphed into a team manager role, and then gave young Chris White, who had been there for a while. He then became chief mechanic. There were other people involved. Already, the time transition had already happened with Harvey Bosses-Waite. This is nothing to do with McLaren, but Harvey Bosses-Waite and Jean-Claude Mijo had joined. But they had John Alesi, so they had a marketable driver to attract the McLaren sponsors, but couldn't be a McLaren. You had a kind of modernisation, but you also had somebody to kind of follow, but was young, and different and something like that.
We talk. You mentioned Michele Alboreto, and Alesi was another. Occasionally, they'd unearth these brilliant drivers who went on to better things. But
so they became more professional, and Villa-de-Prat made it a lot more professional. They were still doing things the same way they were doing in '71, and he said, no, this has to change. This has to change, because eventually you're not going to survive. And the op moments that Tyrrell had in the early to mid-90s are partly because of the framework and things put into there, the foundation. But that would definitely be a situation where Ken did not want to lose control, because what the whole point of this was that Ron Dennis was looking at buying into the team.
Right.
And it would only be a small amount, about 10% they were potentially talking about. If you remember, Tyrrell had Braun sponsorship in 1991. That came solely from McLaren. They had other sponsors, they had all kinds of contacts. And that year, 1991, should have been the year that it all went. And then, if it had gone well, Ron probably would have had 10%, 5%. I'm sure they would have negotiated something.
Sure.
But there was two things. First of all, that Ken had always had control, and to even give 5 or 10% away to somebody that is effectively still a rival, that was one issue. But I think the other issue is, but as Ron said, you have to do things to continue to get sponsorship, and that didn't really sit quite right with Ken. He was not a corporate man at all.
No.
Understood, not totally uncorporate, he understood, but he wasn't willing to make that extra 10%.
I guess it's things like, obviously you sort of have your sponsors and you have their guests, but actually go the extra mile with the guests and things like that. And he was too busy racing the team.
And I think as well, he was slightly concerned, but it would have become a McLaren team. But
junior team.
So you've got now, and we've had for a while, we've got Red Bull and whatever they're
not Toro Rosso,
Alpha Tauri or whatever. He was worried it was going to be like that
Sure.
But Tyrrell would not be Tyrrell, it would be kind of Tyrrell McLaren.
Yeah. And presumably Ken, even though the evidence was there to an objective observer that they were unlikely to ever get back on the top rung, I guess you stay in Formula One, you always hope that there's somewhere there's that sliding doors moment and you go back up to being a top team.
Had they gone for that?
Do you think that was Ken's feeling all the time? Someday it might come back if we're lucky.
I think he always felt that.
Yeah.
You read the interviews. I mean, they had a dreadful 1993.
Yeah.
But Ken was like, "Oh, we had a bad year, but this year we'll win." And he was still saying, "We'll win." I mean, there was no evidence at all in 95, 96, 97, but they were going to win.
Yeah.
But before he left in 98, he was still talking about wins. And I don't think he was deluded. I think he was just extremely... He knew he had talented people.
Yeah.
He knew he had things in place. And this is also what comes across. Those cars in 95, 96, 97, 98, they were well-constructed, good cars. But they were either let down by drivers, not so much drivers, I think that's slightly unfair, but occasionally drivers, having the wrong engine, having the wrong tyres, or just...
and just not the money to develop the car far enough, I guess.
They started, 95, for example, Mick Asalo nearly finished third at Brazil. He was running as high as third again in Argentina, back in the days when they had those flyaway things at the start of the year.
Right.
And he was still at the top, and then it just, as it did every year, it just went off.
Yeah.
Because everybody started at the same level, so that engineering, that ability that Tyrrell had, shone through at the start ahead of other teams. But then the other teams had the finance to develop the car and go that bit further. Jordan, for example, would have started there, Tyrrell would start third, but as it goes along.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And yes, he still believed in his team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, again, that's why people stayed with him, because of his belief and his loyalty and almost love of his team.
Yeah.
But I don't think that Ken, that sliding doors moment, they probably would have then stayed at a level where I think they would have won races, probably challenged Williams and McLaren, not consistently, but if we remember what Jordan did in the late 90s, I think they would have been at that level.
Right.
But I don't think that Ken would have ever really gone for it, because it wasn't his team.
And I suppose, obviously he sold out in 98 to BAL.
Yes.
And I suppose that in a way it was almost like a natural end for the team. I mean, Ken would be at an age then that was probably struggling to run a team. I think he was in his 70s by then, wasn't he?
About 76 when he
started.
So,
and whilst Bob Tyrrell was obviously very involved, he wasn't Ken, and his father was still probably the dominant personality. So in a way, it sort of quite nicely came to an end, that it didn't go bust and it didn't end up in shambles. I don't think, and what you discussed the BAR deal in the book, and they felt they got a raw deal. Well, myself I'm an accountant, I'd say, well, you should have done your research properly. If you feel you got a bum deal, that was your fault for not negotiating it properly, But they did take the name, and they didn't really do much else, but other than take the company, and the company still exists, as you mentioned the other when you came here. The Mercedes Formula One team is actually the Tyrrell team.
Right now,
or it's the Tyrrell company. Yeah.
In Brazil, if you the team with Hamilton that's racing today in Brazil are still the same organisation,
legal entity
on company's house. I think Ken realised that he had to sell. And Bob Tyrrell's looked at it with the benefit of 25 years since, and has said, look, the time was right. Mm-hmm. But what upset Ken so much was the reasons behind why he had to sell, because he was forced into it. With the Concord, again, going back a bit, very briefly, the Concord Agreement
which was the Concord Agreement is the agreement between the teams and the FIA and people like that about how Formula One is run,
so
from a commercial side,
distribution of television money, and Ken did not agree with what Bernie was trying to do. He agreed with what Bernie was trying to do, but not necessarily how he was going about it. And McLaren and Williams had the financial backing. McLaren, Williams and Tyrrell were the three, but said, oh, hang on a minute. And obviously McLaren and Williams were top of the game at the time, they had the money. And basically Tyrrell were kind of forced out effectively because they said, look, this is our TV money, we haven't got it. And that upset Ken. And then I think when BAR came across and kind of said, we don't need you, that upset them even further. So I think the circumstance, what I think Ken would have liked to have done, I get the feeling of this, is Satoru Nakajima was a driver for Tyrrell for 2 years, 1990, 1991, and then had got a kind of Nakajima ran a team in Japan for the team still exists in Japanese Formula 3000 for 30 years, I think.
Right.
But he was speaking to Honda. Obviously, till BAR became Honda, who became Braun, etc., etc. But I have a feeling that Honda would have come along a lot earlier. But because it had been with Nakajima, and Nakajima was Ken's old friend, an old driver, I think ideally Ken would have wanted to sell it to Nakajima.
Right.
Nakajima would have then morphed it. It would stay Tyrrell for a year or two, and then would have morphed into Honda.
Yeah.
And the whole BAR.
Yeah, because when it became BAR, the move location, they literally bought really just the entry into Formula One.
Yeah. And I think if that had happened, he would have been a lot happier about the whole circumstance. But it is what it is.
Looking at those years and the build-up to the sale of it, reading the book, there were years when they virtually seemed to have no money at all. No sponsorship. Yeah. How did they keep going? Where did the money come from? They must have had some money.
For the first few years, Ken was very astute with his money, very astute, and he never ever had a debt. And this is the Jackie Stewart said, and there's a certain bit I can't say in the book, but I can say now. There's not hurting anybody. But Jackie Stewart said that Bernie didn't like the fact, but Ken always had one over him. Bernie liked, not necessarily dirt, but because of the businessman that he was. Bernie is a very interesting character.
Yeah, we know that.
But he's somebody that I found through talking can be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's a means to an end to it.
Sure.
Not always, but sometimes there's a means to an end to it. He couldn't do that with Tyrrell because Ken always ran it on budget. Always. So I think what Ken did during the glory years, he had more money from Elf and Ford and Goodyear and all that sort of thing, and kept it to one side.
Right.
So I would say between 78, because they started to struggle when Elf pulled out around about. They had Pironi, they ran Didier Pironi, and then when Pironi went to So they started to struggle then, but they had the reserves. Ken, they got through. I think that Ken probably put a lot of his personal money into it as well.
Yeah.
Because it seems to be the great.
Did that come from his timber business? Do you think? Or?
I think so, possibly. Again, the timber business kind of just phased out eventually.
Yeah.
But it was extreme. As Ken says in an interview in '67, I'm a timber merchant first, team owner second. And
I think he ran that with his brother, didn't he?
Yes. And without making it, he was an extremely successful businessman. He probably got a fortune from timber. So, although Ken never says anything, and Bob and Kenneth never say anything, I'm quite sure, but Ken, and again, this was the kind of person he is, he put a lot of personal money into
that was where I was sort of guessing, reading between the lines.
But I would imagine, but he didn't want to. Okay. Well, who would? But
exactly.
I think it got to a stage. I think that if Ken hadn't wanted to, maybe the team would have stopped.
Yeah, sure.
81. But he kept going, and I was always amazed at the end of 84, and I did ask Bob Tyrrell this. They've been thrown out of the championship. They've lost all the sponsors.
Yeah, that's the time when you think, I'll give up.
They've lost the TV money. They've lost this. And at one point, Ken was seriously thinking about running Tyrrell and Formula 3000. Formula 3000 just come along as a new, replaced the old European Formula 2.
Yeah, I remember it.
And he went, this is something interesting. But Bob said to Ken, if we go into Formula 3000 now, we won't get back into Formula 1. Yeah. If you want to stay in Formula 1, we need to.
It's twice as hard to come back.
Yes, and I think then as well, Ken would have done what he needed to do, because everybody says we're always paid on time. Yeah. And I think that Ken dipped into his personal fund again and said, no, I'm not letting these people have done nothing wrong. I'm going to support them. And I think he had help, because obviously Renault came along back with their turbo engines. So there was a degree of money with that. And they just kept going where they could. Okay. But yes, I would imagine there was a little bit of...
Okay. There's lots of things we could cover, and before we get to sort of concluding points, I'd like to take a step back, and the one particular car, and I guess it's because it was the period I got interested in Formula 1, was the P34, the six-wheeler. One of the most unique Formula 1 cars ever.
It's on the back cover.
Everybody. Yeah, it's on the back cover of here, isn't it? Yes, we're talking about this one. One of the things that comes across, obviously it was out of the box thinking, and I wondered whether it ran for 2 seasons, won 1 Grand Prix.
Yes.
And I always wondered, was it a bad concept, or was it a blind alley? Although obviously, if it won a Grand Prix, it wasn't that bad. Or was it the case that? And I'm asking your opinion on this. Do you think it could have been really successful had it got the support of particularly Goodyear, for example, and they developed special tyres for it, etc. Do you think? And I know you're not an engineer, and it's difficult for you to talk from a technical point of view. But do you think, had it got the full backing of people at that time, do you think it could have been the car? Interestingly, it was only just after that Colin Chapman came up with the ground effects cars, which was another completely different concept that worked. Anyway,
I think long term probably not.
Right.
Because they took a gamble, because they were hoping for not necessarily instant success, but I think in some ways Derek Gardner had been spoilt. That's probably not the right word, but he had been spoilt because he constructed this new car, the 003, and it won first time out. And you've got this guy, but it's just a transmission. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but he is just a transmissions guy. He's got no design background at all. And then lo and behold, he comes along and they win all the championships. And I have a feeling that his enthusiasm got ahead of him in terms of the reality.
Yeah.
And he was thinking, well, if this wins and this wins and this wins. And it won, obviously, as you say. But it needed the right set of circumstances. And in Sweden, where it won, it was slightly cooler, the track was better for him, and it was found that there was such a variation of tracks,
right,
and circuits, but it's not always going to work quite so well at another circuit. Now, you mentioned about James Hunt, and obviously that was a golden year, but you've got Niki Lauda dominating all, James Hunt comes firing back, Goodyear are right in the middle of all of this, and they had to make a very quick decision. Well, do we support everyone or do we support this project?
And at that time, everyone ran Goodyear tyres. So
yes.
Why would they spend extra money on researching and all the rest of it for no extra publicity?
Yeah, and I think that was the bit that Gardner, and it seems a bit rude of me to have a go at Gardner because obviously I'm no engineer, the things we came up with. But I think in retrospect, and speaking to other people as well, some that knew him and some that have been designers themselves, there was no plan B, or there was no tweaking, there was no thinking, if Goodyear don't go for this, we're stuck.
Yeah.
So how can we develop the P34?
Yeah.
I think they kind of just got stuck to the original plan. And I mean, somebody said that if it had gone on radial tyres for Michelin, for example, because they came along very, very swiftly after.
Yeah, they did, didn't they?
Somebody said it would have been a winner.
Yeah.
But again, you have to have that dedication.
And also, if they had Michelin came in, and again, no disrespect to Goodyear, but there was no great incentive for them to spend a lot developing the tyres that you do get when you got a competitor.
Yeah. And it wasn't as... I think the thing was as well, the death knell of it was, and this happened quite early on, when Tyrrell came up with an airbox, a particular airbox in 72, I could be wrong, but 72, at the French Grand Prix. There's a picture of the French Grand Prix at the start, I'm sure it's 72, and you've got varying kind of airboxes. You've got no airboxes, or you've got a Mahusiv one, or you've got a kind of Trident one, and they... Back in the day, you could just turn up, and then everybody copied that. So you've got 4 races along, everybody's got the same airbox because they realised how successful it was. I think, again, they hedged their bets and thought, right, everybody's going to see the 6-wheeler, it's going to do well, people follow up. A few people tried, but there were more.
But they had 4 at the back, and I think it was a March, and I think Williams did it as well.
Yeah, Williams did it as well. But this was a very different Williams team back then.
That was
very much a budget.
Before Frank sold to Wolf and then started Williams Grand Prix 2, if you like, I forget what the...
So nobody really jumped. If Ferrari had or McLaren had, maybe it'd been different. But that was the problem. They had no follow-up concept. And I think that Derek, I say it in the book, or somebody else says it in the book, Derek started to, is out of loyalty, kind of just got stuck with it.
Yeah.
And then Maurice Philippe, who obviously had a extremely successful background in designing, comes along, goes, well, let's just try this. This isn't going to work, but I'll work with Derek. I'll try this. And it was clear it wasn't going to work. And it wasn't just the tyres. They had all sorts of balance issues.
Yeah.
All other kind of problems. It was never like super quick out the box. And I don't think it would have... It was a great thing for them to try.
Yeah.
But if anything has actually changed, the one design, I'm jumping way forward, but the one design that changed it, which is on the front of the book, is the high nose.
Yeah.
That arguably and people might disagree, but arguably that is the one innovation that changed Formula One, but came from Tyrrell.
Yeah. I mean, I think with that, you've got a team. They came up with some innovating ideas, but because they didn't have the strength, the budget, they didn't have the resources,
foresight,
to
well.
you know, when we touched on the Lotus in '78 with the Lotus 79 ground effects car, they had the budget to run that car and maximise its potential, and Tyrrell, obviously with the high nose, probably didn't, and maybe they had the wrong jet engine or whatever, but they actually had a concept that worked. Well, thank you very much for your time. As I say, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I hope anybody else who picks it up, I'm sure they'll enjoy it.
I hope they do too.
It's a really a worthwhile read. If you want to read about Tyrrell, that's the starting point for me, I would say. Thank you very much for your time. We've hosted you twice now at Brooklands, and we're glad to see you here. Hope you come along again. So that concludes the interview, and all the best for the future.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Thank you.